$50 million vanished in the blink of an eye, but this wasn't a robbery, it was a lesson. When Arthur Pendelton stood in the middle of Le Bernardin, smirking as he watched the waiter hand back a declined black card to his wife, he thought he had finally broken her. He thought stripping her of her allowance would force her back into submission. He was wrong. He didn't know that while he was cutting off her credit, she was finalizing the paperwork to buy the very bank that issued them. This is the story of how one man's arrogance became his wife's greatest acquisition. The humidity in New York City that August was oppressive, the kind that made the air shimmer above the pavement and stuck shirt collars to necks. But inside the private dining room of Le Bernardin, the temperature was kept at a crisp, indifferent 68 degrees. Arthur Pendelton adjusted his cufflinks, vintage Cartier, onyx and gold, and checked his reflection in the darkened window. At 46, Arthur was the picture of Wall Street virility. He was the CEO of Pendelton Capital, a mid-sized hedge fund that had aggressively swallowed up 3 tech startups in the last quarter. He was a man who believed the world operated on a simple binary, the conquerors and the conquered. Sitting opposite him was Vivian. At 42, Vivian Pendelton still possessed the sharp, arresting beauty that had made her a standout debutante in Newport 20 years ago. But Arthur liked to think he had polished that beauty, refined it like a raw diamond. When they met, she was Vivian Clark, the daughter of a washed-up academic with a great pedigree but zero liquidity. Now she was Mrs. Pendelton, a woman who wore 5-figure Chanel suits to charity luncheons and nodded politely while Arthur explained the bond market to people who understood it better than he did. "You're not eating the scallop," Arthur said, not looking up from his phone. He was tracking the Nikkei index. Vivian looked down at the plate. "I'm not hungry, Arthur. We need to talk about the house in the Hamptons." The contractor called again. "He says the check for the landscaping bounced." Arthur finally looked up. His eyes were a pale, watery blue, devoid of warmth. "It didn't bounce, Vivian." "I cancelled it." Vivian blinked, her fork freezing halfway to the table. "Are you?" "What? I cancelled it," Arthur repeated, his voice smooth, carrying that patronizing lilt he reserved for children and his wife. "Just like I cancelled the order for the new curtains and the deposit for your little art gallery project in Soho." The silence that stretched between them was heavy. A waiter hovered near the door, sensing the tension, trained to be invisible but unable to miss the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. "Arthur," Vivian said, her voice low. "The gallery opening is in 2 weeks. I have artists flying in from Berlin. I signed contracts, and you signed them as Vivian Pendelton," Arthur said, taking a sip of his Montrachet. "Which means you signed them with my money. And frankly, darling, I'm tired of funding your hobbies. You've been distant lately. Unappreciative. I think it's time for a reset. A reminder of where the water comes from," he signaled the waiter. "Check, please." Vivian sat very still. She had been married to Arthur for 15 years. She had signed a prenup that was thicker than a phone book, drafted by the sharks at Skadden Arps. She knew the rules. She was the trophy, the hostess, the mother to his heirs, if they ever had any, which they hadn't, and in exchange, she lived a life of unlimited comfort. But this was new. This public cruelty. "I need to pay the caterers tomorrow," Vivian said, her voice trembling slightly. It wasn't fear, though Arthur interpreted it as such. It was a tremor of rage. Arthur smiled. It was a cruel, tight smile. "Well, I suppose you'll have to use your own resources." "Oh, wait. You don't have any." The waiter arrived with the leather folder. Arthur waved a hand. "Actually, my wife would like to treat me tonight." A gesture of goodwill. "Use her card." The waiter looked between them, uncomfortable. "Sir, you heard me. The Amex Centurion." "The one in her purse." Vivian stared at him. "Arthur, don't do this. Pay the bill, Vivian." Slowly, with shaking hands, Vivian reached into her Hermes Birkin bag. She pulled out the heavy, black titanium card. She knew what was coming. She could see it in the gleam of his eyes. She handed the card to the waiter. Arthur watched her leaning back, arms crossed. He wanted this. He needed to see her humiliated, to see the realization hit her that without him, she was nothing. He had spent the morning on the phone with the risk management department at American Express, flagging the card for suspicious activity and lowering the limit to 0. The waiter walked to the terminal near the sideboard. He inserted the card. He waited. He frowned. He tried again. The seconds ticked by like hours. The clinking of silverware from the main dining room felt miles away. The waiter returned, his face flushed. I'm terribly sorry, madame. The card has been declined." Arthur let out a theatrical sigh. "Declined? That's embarrassing." "Are you sure? It says issuer rejected, sir," Arthur tusked. "Well, Vivian, it seems you've been cut off." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The cards, the bank accounts, the lines of credit at Sachs and Bergdorf, S. All of it. Gone. Until you learn to appreciate who provides it." He tossed his own card, a gold corporate Visa, onto the table. "Put it on this. And add a 20% tip." "I'm not a monster." Vivian didn't cry. That was what surprised Arthur the most. Usually she would tear up, played, or storm out. Instead, she sat there, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite place. It wasn't defeat. It looked almost like pity. "You really think," Vivian said, her voice steady now, "that money is the only thing that holds a marriage together?" "In our circle," Arthur laughed. "It's the only thing that holds the world together." Vivian stood up. She smoothed the front of her dress. She didn't pick up her purse. She didn't look at the waiter. She looked straight at Arthur. "You're right, Arthur. It is about who provides. I just think you've forgotten who that actually is." She turned and walked out of the restaurant. Arthur chuckled, shaking his head as he signed the receipt. He thought she was walking out to cry in the town car. He thought she would be back at the penthouse in an hour, begging for forgiveness, ready to be the obedient wife again. He pulled out his phone and texted his mistress, a 24-year-old analyst at a rival firm. "She's handled. Dinner tomorrow." He had no idea that as Vivian walked out onto 51st Street, she wasn't calling a driver. She was calling a man named Elias Vane. And she wasn't crying. She was calculating. Vivian walked 3 blocks before she hailed a yellow cab. She didn't want the digital trail of an Uber, and she certainly didn't want Arthur's private driver, a massive ex-NYPD officer named Miller who reported her every movement to know where she was going. 75 Rockefeller Plaza, she told the driver. She checked her watch. It was 8:45 p.m. The offices of Vane and Associates would still be buzzing. In the world of high-stakes forensic accounting and corporate restructuring, the lights never went off. Vivian leaned back against the cracked vinyl seat of the taxi. Arthur thought she was Vivian Clark, the penniless daughter of a professor. And that was true. But he had never bothered to ask what kind of professor her father was. Professor Samuel Clark had taught advanced game theory and economic warfare at the London School of Economics. He hadn't left her money, but he had left her something far more dangerous, a mind trained to spot leverage where others saw only noise. For 15 years, Vivian had played the role. She had arranged the flowers, hosted the galas, and smiled for the cameras. But she had also been watching. She listened when Arthur bragged about his short positions after 3 scotches. She remembered the names of the shell companies he used to hide assets in the Cayman Islands. She kept a mental ledger of every bribe, every regulatory skirt, every shady deal Pendelton Capital had executed. But she hadn't acted. Not until today. Today he had crossed the line. He had tried to break her spirit. The taxi pulled up to Rockefeller Plaza. Vivian paid with cash, a stash she kept in a hollowed-out lipstick case, and walked into the lobby. She didn't need a pass. The security guard, an older man named George, nodded to her. "Evening, Ms. Clark. Mr. Vane is expecting you in the war room." She took the elevator to the 42nd floor. The doors opened to a sleek, modern office that smelled of espresso and ozone. Elias Vane was standing by a floor-to-ceiling whiteboard covered in red ink, arguing with 2 junior associates. Elias was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and dressed by Savile Row. He was Arthur's opposite in every way, quiet, lethal, and fiercely loyal. He had been Arthur's college roommate at Wharton, and for years, Arthur had mocked him for going into boring, forensic accounting while Arthur chased the glory of hedge funds. Arthur didn't know that Elias had been in love with Vivian since the day they all met at a mixer in 1998. And he certainly didn't know that, for the last 6 months, Elias had been helping Vivian build a dossier. "Everyone out," Elias said the moment he saw Vivian. The associates scattered like pigeons. Elias walked over to her. He didn't try to hug her. He just looked at her face, reading the tension in her jaw. "He did it?" Elias asked. "He cut the cards at Le Bernardin," Vivian said, tossing her Birkin onto a conference table. Declined. In front of the staff, Elias let out a low whistle. The full nuclear option. He's feeling confident. He thinks I'm helpless, Elias. He thinks I'm going to go home and beg. And instead, Vivian walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling lights of Manhattan. Somewhere out there, Arthur was probably ordering another bottle of wine, feeling like a king. Instead, Vivian said, turning back, I want to trigger the clause. Elias froze. Vivian, are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. It's total war. If we miss, he'll bury you. He has the best lawyers in the city. He has judges in his pocket. He has leverage, Vivian corrected. Or he thinks he does. But he forgets who actually owns the charter for Pendelton Capital. This was the secret that Arthur had conveniently forgotten or perhaps suppressed over the last decade. When Arthur started his firm, he had bad credit due to a failed venture in his 20s. He needed a guarantor with a pristine, albeit modest, financial history to secure the initial banking charter. Vivian had signed. But there was a rider in that original charter, a spousal protection clause inserted by her father, who had reviewed the documents days before he died. It stated that in the event of financial malice or gross mismanagement proven by a third-party auditor, the primary guarantor, Vivian, could petition the board for an emergency freeze of the CEO's executive powers. It was a long shot. It was an obscure clause from 2005. But combined with what Elias had found, it was a jagged knife. The bank he uses, Elias said, pulling up a file on his tablet. First Hudson Trust. It's a regional bank. Old money. Conservative. They hold the majority of his operating capital. I know, Vivian said. Arthur treats the CEO, Harrison Caldwell, like a drinking buddy. He thinks they're thick as thieves. Caldwell is a shark, Elias noted. He cares about stability. If he thinks Arthur is a liability, he'll drop him, Vivian finished. But we need more than just the clause. We need to own the narrative. Arthur cut off my credit cards. Fine. I want to cut off his liquidity. Elias tapped the screen. We've been tracking his latest acquisition. The outcome of the Project Chimera merger. He's over-leveraged, Vivian. He borrowed heavily against his personal equity in the firm to make that deal happen. If the stock price of Pendelton Capital drops by even 8%, he gets a margin call. A massive one, Vivian smiled, and for the first time that night, it reached her eyes. And what would cause the stock to drop 8%? Elias grinned. A vote of no confidence from the bank that holds his debt. Lord. A rumor that the CEO is being investigated for embezzlement. We have the proof of the embezzlement, Vivian said, touching the locket around her neck. Inside wasn't a picture, but a micro-SD card. The transfers to the Cayman accounts. The consulting fees paid to his mistress. It's enough to start an inquiry, Elias agreed. But to take the bank, to take First Hudson, Arthur thinks I'm broke, Vivian said softly. He doesn't know about the Bitcoin. Elias paused. Excuse me, in 2011, Vivian said, I took the housekeeping money Arthur gave me. 5,000 a month. I didn't spend it on clothes. I bought Bitcoin. It was $10 a coin then. Elias did the math in his head. His eyes widened. Vivian, if you held onto that, I have roughly $45 million in a cold wallet in a safety deposit box in Zurich, she said calmly. I never touched it. I saved it for a rainy day. Well, it's pouring. You want to buy First Hudson Trust? Elias asked, stunned. No, Vivian said. I want to become the majority shareholder of the holding company that owns it. I did my research, Elias. First Hudson is publicly traded, but it's small cap. 45 million buys me a seat at the head of the table. Or at least enough of a seat to demand a meeting with Harrison Caldwell. You want to be your husband's banker, Elias whispered. I want to be the one who declines his card, Vivian said. Set up the meeting with Caldwell. Tomorrow morning. Tell him Mrs. Pendelton has a business proposition that concerns the solvency of his biggest client. He won't meet with you. He'll think it's a domestic dispute. Tell him, Vivian said, her voice hard as steel, that if he doesn't meet with me, I'll release the documents showing that his bank knowingly laundered Arthur's money for the last 5 years. Tell him I'm coming to save his bank, not bury it. Elias looked at her with newfound awe. The debutante was gone. The trophy wife had vanished. In her place was a corporate raider. I'll make the call, Elias said. Vivian turned back to the window. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red. Arthur was probably asleep by now, or with the girl. He had no idea that the credit card he had cut was the only thing keeping him tethered to safety. He had severed the line, thinking he was setting her adrift. He was wrong. He had just untied the boat, and Vivian was finally the captain. Tomorrow, she whispered to the glass. Checkmate, the headquarters of First Hudson Trust, sat on the corner of Wall and William, a limestone fortress that had survived the crash of '29, the stagnation of the '70s, and the meltdown of 2008. It projected an image of unshakable stability. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but stable. At 8:15 a.m., 15 minutes before the market opened, Vivian Pendelton walked through the revolving bronze doors. She looked different. Gone were the soft pastels and the flowing silk she wore to Arthur's charity galas. Today, she wore a structured, charcoal grey suit by Alexander McQueen, the jacket tailored to look almost like armor. Her hair, usually worn in loose waves, was pulled back into a severe, sleek bun. She wore no jewelry except for her wedding band, a calculated reminder of her legal standing. She bypassed the main reception desk and headed straight for the private elevator reserved for executive clients. A security guard, a young man named O'Malley, who had held the door for her countless times when she visited with Arthur, stepped forward, looking pained. Mrs. Pendelton, he stammered, holding up a hand. I'm sorry, but Mr. Caldwell left specific instructions. No unauthorized visitors for the executive suite today. Vivian didn't slow down. She stopped 2 inches from his chest, forcing him to take a step back. "Good morning, O'Malley," she said, her voice pleasant but devoid of warmth. "I'm not a visitor. I'm a shareholder. And I'm here to discuss a compliance issue regarding the solvency of the bank's largest commercial loan." I can't, ma'am." "Mr. Caldwell, tell Harrison," Vivian cut in, her eyes locking onto the guards, "that I have the transaction logs for Blue Heron Holdings. Tell him I know about the wire transfer scheduled for noon today. And tell him that if he doesn't open this elevator in 30 seconds, I'm sending those logs to the district attorney's office from my phone right here in the lobby." O'Malley swallowed hard. He touched his earpiece. "So, it's Mrs. Pendelton." She mentioned Blue Heron. A pause. O'Malley's face went pale. He stepped aside and keyed the elevator. "44th floor, ma'am." "He's waiting." When the elevator doors opened, Harrison Caldwell was standing in the hallway, flanked by his general counsel. Harrison was a man who prided himself on his calm demeanor, a trait he had cultivated at Exeter and Yale. But today there was a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. "Vivian," Harrison said, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace, "this is highly irregular. Arthur isn't here." "I know Arthur isn't here, Harrison," Vivian said, walking past him into his corner office without waiting for an invitation. She sat at the head of the mahogany conference table. "If Arthur were here, we'd be having a very different conversation." "Close the door." Harrison hesitated, then nodded to his lawyer to leave. He shut the door and turned to her, his face hardening. "Look, Vivian. I don't know what kind of marital spat you and Arthur are having, but dragging my bank into it is dangerous. Arthur is our key client. You threatening my staff with Blue Heron Holdings is a shell company registered in the Seychelles," Vivian interrupted, pulling a thin file from her briefcase. She slid it across the polished wood. "It has no employees, no office, and no product. Yet, for the last 5 years, Arthur has been moving $300,000 a month from Pendelton Capital's operating account into Blue Heron, listed as consulting fees." Harrison stared at the file. "He didn't open it. That's standard tax optimization. It's embezzlement, Harrison," Vivian said softly. "And since First Hudson Trust facilitates the transfers, that makes you complicit in money laundering. I had Elias Vane run the numbers. The routing numbers on the receiving end don't go to a consultant. They go to a private account in Zurich. An account that Arthur controls." Harrison sank into the chair opposite her. The color had drained from his face. If this gets out," Vivian continued, "the SEC freezes your charter. Your stock plummets. You go to federal prison. And Arthur, he'll claim he didn't know that you advised him on the structure." Harrison rubbed his temples. "What do you want, Vivian?" "Alimony. A settlement. We can work something out. I can call Arthur Do not call Arthur, she snapped. The command cracked through the room like a whip. You are going to do exactly what I tell you, Harrison, or I will burn this entire building down with you inside it. She leaned forward. Arthur is trying to close the merger with Apex Dynamics today. He needs $20 million in liquidity to seal the deal. He's leveraging his personal equity in the firm, equity that is technically marital property, to secure the bridge loan from this bank. Harrison nodded slowly. The paperwork is on my desk. The wire is scheduled for 11:30 a.m. Cancel it, Vivian said. I can't just cancel a $20 million facility, Harrison sputtered. The contracts are signed. We have a fiduciary duty. Read the fine print of the spousal guarantor clause in his original charter, Vivian said. The one my father insisted on. In the event of financial irregularity, the guarantor may request an immediate freeze of all credit facilities pending an audit. That clause is ancient, Harrison argued. It hasn't been invoked in decades. It's still legal, Vivian said. And here is your audit. She tapped the file on the table. I am formally invoking the clause. I am freezing the assets. If you authorize that wire to Apex Dynamics, you are knowingly dispersing funds from a compromised account. That makes you personally liable for the loss. Harrison looked at the file, then at Vivian. He saw the resolve in her eyes. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that the woman who used to discuss flower arrangements with his wife was currently holding a gun to his head. If I freeze the assets, Harrison whispered, the Apex deal falls through. Arthur's stock will crash. He'll be ruined. He cut off my credit cards last night, Harrison, Vivian said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. He humiliated me for a $200 dinner bill. Do you really think I care if he loses a merger? She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city Arthur thought he owned. Freeze the accounts, Harrison. All of them. The corporate lines, the personal checking, the Cayman transfers. I want him to swipe his card for a pack of gum and get declined. And when he calls you screaming, you're going to tell him it's a compliance review. He'll come here, Harrison warned. He'll tear the place apart. Let him, Vivian said. I'll be waiting, she turned back to him. Oh, and one more thing. I want access to the internal transaction ledger. Real time. I want to see every penny he tries to move. Harrison hesitated. That's highly irregular. So is laundering money for a hedge fund manager, Vivian countered. Do we have a deal, or am I calling the SEC? Harrison Caldwell, the master of the universe, the CEO of First Hudson Trust, looked at the phone on his desk. He looked at the file. He looked at Vivian. He picked up the phone. Get me compliance, he said into the receiver, his voice hollow. And put a hold on the Pendelton wire. Yes, the whole thing. Code red, Vivian smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a hunter who just heard the trap snap shut. 3 miles uptown, in the glass-walled conference room of Pendelton Capital, Arthur Pendelton was feeling invincible. The room was filled with the smell of expensive cologne and the low hum of anticipation. On one side of the table sat Arthur and his team. His CFO, Winston Myers, a man who sweated profusely under pressure, and Sienna, the 24-year-old analyst who was currently serving as both his lead researcher and his mistress. On the other side sat the team from Apex Dynamics, led by their CEO, a rugged Texan named Bill Sterling. Sterling was old school. He didn't trust hedge funds, but he needed the capital Arthur was offering to take his robotics company global. "We are ready to sign, Arthur," Sterling said, tapping his pen on the leather-bound document. "But my board is nervous. They want to see the good faith deposit in our account before we release the IP." Arthur laughed, leaning back in his Eames chair. He checked his Rolex. It was 11:45 a.m. "Bill, please." "The wire was authorized this morning. It's moving through the clearing house as we speak. My bankers at First Hudson know better than to hold up my money." He glanced at Sienna, giving her a subtle wink. She smiled back, typing something on her iPad. She looked stunning in a cream blouse, the kind of woman Arthur felt he deserved, young, hungry, and completely dependent on him. "I've got the confirmation screen up," Winston said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "Just waiting for the sent notification." Arthur turned back to Sterling. "See. Done deal. By lunch, we'll be toasting to the future of robotics." He stood up. "In fact, why don't we head to Maria? I've reserved the private room. We can celebrate while the computers do their work." Sterling hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But if that money isn't there by 1:00 p.m., the deal is void." "That's the contract. It'll be there," Arthur assured him. The group moved out of the conference room, a phalanx of suits marching toward the elevators. Arthur felt a vibration in his pocket. He ignored it. Probably Vivian calling to apologize. He'd let her sweat a few more hours before he answered. At Maria, the mood was jovial. Arthur ordered 3 bottles of vintage Dom Perignon. He held court, telling stories about his days at Wharton, omitting the parts where he cheated on exams and relied on Elia's vein to pass statistics. To Apex, Arthur toasted, raising his glass. To the money, Sterling replied dryly, clinking his glass against Arthur's. At 12:45 p.m., Winston's phone buzzed. He looked at it, frowned, and tapped the screen. Then he tapped it again, harder. "Arthur," Winston whispered, leaning over. "I'm getting an error message." Arthur waved a hand dismissively. "It's a glitch, Winston. Refresh the page." "I did," Winston hissed. "It says transaction failed, insufficient authorization." Arthur's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Don't be an idiot. There's 40 million in that account." "Call the desk." Winston scurried away from the table to make the call. Arthur turned back to Sterling, who was watching him closely. "Technical difficulties," Arthur laughed. "Bankers, am I right? They probably transposed a digit 5 minutes past. Winston didn't return. 10 minutes. Arthur excused himself, standing up with a tight smile. "I'll just go see what the holdup is. Probably a compliance check." He walked toward the front of the restaurant, his stride confident, but his heart rate beginning to climb. He found Winston in the foyer, pale as a sheet, holding his phone like it was a live grenade. "What is it?" Arthur demanded. They won't put the wire through, Arthur. Who won't?" "Harrison, compliance. They said the account is frozen." Code red, code red." Arthur grabbed the phone from Winston's hand. "Give me that." He dialed Harrison's direct line. It rang. And rang. And rang. Then voicemail. Arthur cursed and dialed the main desk at First Hudson. "Executive Services, this is Sarah. Sarah, this is Arthur Pendelton. Get Harrison on the line." "Now, I'm sorry, Mr. Pendelton." The voice was cool, professional. "Mr. Caldwell is in a meeting. I don't care if he's meeting with the president. My wire to Apex was just rejected." "Fix it. I'm looking at your file, sir," Sarah said. "I see a spousal guarantor freeze initiated at 9:00 a.m. this morning. All credit facilities, outgoing wires, and asset transfers are suspended pending an audit." Arthur froze. The noise of the restaurant seemed to drop away, leaving him in a vacuum of silence. "Spousal. What? Your guarantor, Mrs. Vivian Pendelton, initiated the freeze. She provided documentation triggering the insolvency clause." "Vivian," Arthur shouted, causing the hostess to jump. "Vivian doesn't have the authority to freeze my company accounts. Actually, sir, according to the charter from 2005, she does. She is the primary guarantor on the master liquidity agreement." Arthur felt the blood rush to his head. He was dizzy. Vivian had done this. "Unfreeze it," he snarled. "Oh, she's mentally unstable. We're going through a divorce. This is vindictive. I can't do that, sir. You'll have to come into the branch to resolve the dispute. Until then, the accounts are locked." The line went dead. Arthur stood there, staring at the phone. He looked back at the private dining room. Sterling was checking his watch. The deal deadline was in 8 minutes. If he didn't pay, the deal died. If the deal died, the stock price would collapse. If the stock collapsed, the margin calls on his personal loans would hit. He needed cash. No. He turned to Winston. "Give me your corporate card." "What?" "The black card, Winston." "Give it to me. We'll pay the deposit on the card. We can run it in tranches. Arthur, the limit is only 500,000. Just give it to me." Arthur snatched the card and marched to the Meta D station. "I need to run a transaction." "A large one." He handed over Winston's card. The Meta D swiped it. "Declined." Arthur stared at the machine. "Try mine." He pulled out his gold Visa. "Declined." "Try the Amex." He pulled out another. "Declined." Sweat was pouring down his back now. He felt like he was suffocating. Every card, every account, every lifeline cut. He looked up to see Sterling, standing in the doorway of the dining room. The Texan put on his cowboy hat. 1:00 p.m. Arthur, Sterling said, his voice carrying across the silent restaurant. Money's not there, Bill, wait. It's a bank error. I can write you a personal check. I don't take bad papers, son, Sterling said. Deal's off. I'm calling the guys at Goldman. They were second in line. Sterling walked out. The Apex team followed. Arthur stood alone in the middle of the restaurant. The waiters were staring. The other diners were whispering. Sienna walked up to him, her phone in her hand. Martha, the news just broke. CNBC is reporting that the Apex deal fell through due to liquidity concerns at Pendelton Capital. She showed him the screen. The ticker at the bottom showed PDLT. It was down 12%. Arthur grabbed the edge of the hostess stand to steady himself. This wasn't just a lesson. This was an assassination. Where is she? Arthur whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and terror. Where is Vivian? I don't know, Sienna said, backing away slightly. She had never seen him look like this, desperate, sweaty, old. Arthur pulled out his phone again. He didn't call Harrison. He called his driver. Miller, get the car. We're going to First Hudson. I can't, Mr. Pendelton. What do you mean you can't? Mrs. Pendelton called, sir. She said the lease on the town car is in her name. She cancelled the service. They just came and towed the car from the garage. Arthur dropped the phone. It clattered onto the marble floor. He had no car. He had no credit. He had no deal. And his stock was in freefall. He looked out the window. It was starting to rain. He had to get to the bank. He had to face her. He had to run. He pushed past the startled maitre d' and ran out onto the street, his hand raised for a taxi. But in the pouring rain of New York City, no one stops for a desperate man in a wet suit. The rain in Manhattan didn't just fall, it assaulted. By the time Arthur Pendelton reached the bronze doors of First Hudson Trust, he looked less like a master of the universe and more like a drowned rat. His $3,000 suit was heavy with water, his shoes squelched with every step, and his hair was plastered to his skull. He didn't care. Adrenaline and rage were the only things keeping him upright. He burst through the revolving doors, startling the lobby staff. Harrison, he screamed, his voice echoing off the marble walls. Harrison, get down here. O'Malley, the security guard who had been terrified of Vivian earlier that morning, stepped forward. He looked at Arthur not with fear, but with a mixture of pity and resolve. Mr. Pendelton, O'Malley said, holding up a hand. I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. Lower my voice. Do you know who I am? I own this bank's biggest portfolio. I want to see Caldwell right now. Mr. Caldwell is in a board meeting. A cool voice cut through the air. Arthur spun around. Standing on the mezzanine balcony, looking down at him like a queen surveying a peasant revolt, was Vivian. She was dry. She was impeccable, and she was flanked by Elias Vane. Arthur lunged toward the stairs, but two more guards stepped in his path. "What have you done? You froze my accounts. You tanked the Apex deal. Do you have any idea how much money I lost in the last hour?" "I know exactly how much," Vivian said, descending the stairs slowly, the click of her heels the only sound in the cavernous lobby. "Because I'm the one who shorted your stock." Arthur froze. "Are you?" "What? I shorted Pendelton Capital at 9:30 a.m., Vivian said, reaching the bottom step. She stopped 10 feet from him. "Leveraged 100 to 1. When the news of the failed Apex deal hit and the stock dropped 12%, I made a fortune. Enough, in fact, to cover the buyout." "Buyout?" Arthur blinked, water dripping into his eyes. "What buyout?" Elias Vane stepped forward, holding a thick sheaf of documents. "Arthur, you always were bad at due diligence. You thought First Hudson Trust was owned by a diversified group of anonymous investors. It was. Until this morning." Elias handed Arthur a document. It was a transfer of ownership filing. At 10:00 a.m., Elias explained, a holding company called Vane and Clark executed a block trade, purchasing 51% of the voting shares of First Hudson's parent company. "We paid a premium. Harrison Caldwell didn't just freeze your account because of the spousal clause, Arthur. He froze it because his new boss told him to." Arthur looked at Vivian. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Are you? You bought the bank," he whispered. "I bought the bank that holds your debt," Vivian corrected. "And Arthur, I've been reviewing your loan agreements. Specifically, the covenants on your personal lines of credit. They state that if your net worth drops below $10 million, the bank has the right to call in all loans immediately. My net worth is $50 million, Arthur spat. "Not anymore," Vivian said calmly. She pulled out her phone and showed him the screen. Pendelton Capital stock is now down 35%. The rumors of embezzlement, which I may have accidentally let slip to the SEC compliance officer, have caused a run on your fund. Your investors are pulling out. Your assets are being frozen by the feds as we speak. You did this," Arthur hissed, stepping closer. "You vindictive. I'll sue you." "I'll ruin you. With what money?" Vivian asked. "I cancelled your retainer with Skadden. And I just fired your personal lawyer. Did you know he banks here too? We had a lovely chat about his mortgage." Arthur felt the room spinning. This wasn't a divorce. This was a slaughter. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Because I cut off your credit card. Because I embarrassed you at dinner. Because you underestimated me," Vivian said. She leaned in close, so only he could hear. "You thought I was an accessory, Arthur. A prop for your lives. You forgot that I was the one who edited your speeches. I was the one who introduced you to the right people. I was the foundation you built your castle on. And yesterday, when you tried to humiliate me, you didn't just hurt my feelings. You breached the contract." She straightened up and looked at O'Malley. "Security," she said. "Please escort Mr. Pendelton off the premises. He is no longer a client of First Hudson Trust. You can't do this," Arthur screamed as the guards grabbed his arms. "I'm Arthur Pendelton. I built this city. You rented it," Vivian said, turning her back on him. "And the lease is up." As they dragged him toward the door, Arthur saw Harrison Caldwell watching from the glass elevator. Harrison looked away, ashamed. Arthur was thrown out onto the wet pavement of Wall Street. He scrambled to his feet, looking around for an ally, a friend, anyone. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Sienna. "I heard about the SEC investigation. Don't come to the apartment. I'm changing the codes. Also, I'm keeping the jewelry. Consider it severance." Arthur stood alone in the rain, staring at the fortress of First Hudson Trust. The lights were on inside, warm and golden. He was on the outside. And for the first time in 20 years, he didn't have a card to get back in. The fall of Arthur Pendelton was swift, brutal, and televised. By 3:00 p.m., CNBC had a chyron running across. The bottom of the screen, Pendelton Capital under SEC investigation. CEO assets frozen. Arthur sat in a dive bar in Hell's Kitchen, nursing a beer he had paid for with the crumpled $20 bill he found in his jacket pocket. It was the only money he had left. Every time he tried to use Apple Pay, it declined. He watched the TV above the bar. They were showing footage of FBI agents carrying boxes out of his office. He saw Winston, his CFO, being led out in handcuffs. Winston had apparently cut a deal the moment the feds walked in, pointing the finger squarely at Arthur for the offshore accounts. Arthur took a sip of the warm beer. He should have been on a plane to Belize. But he couldn't buy a ticket. He couldn't even call a cab to the airport. At 4:30 p.m., his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Pendelton," he answered, his voice raspy. "Mr. Pendelton, this is Detective Miller, NYPD. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding grand larceny and securities fraud. We know you're in the city. We suggest you turn yourself in at the first precinct." Arthur hung up. He threw the phone into a trash can. He walked out of the bar. He had nowhere to go. The penthouse on Park Avenue. Vivian had changed the locks. The Hamptons house. Seized by the bank. He found himself walking toward the one place he had avoided for years, the small, rent-controlled apartment in Queens where his mother lived. She was the only person who didn't know or care about hedge funds. But when he got to the subway station, he realized he didn't have enough fare for a Metro card. The turnstile was a barrier as insurmountable as the vault door at First Hudson. He sat on a bench in the station, watching the commuters rush by. They looked tired, worn down. He had always looked down on them. He called them civilians. Now he wasn't even a civilian. He was a ghost. A young woman sat down next to him. She was reading a newspaper. On the front page was a picture of Vivian, looking strong and defiant, leaving the bank. The headline read, "The Iron Rose, How Vivian Pendelton Exposed Wall Street's Darkest Secret." Arthur stared at the photo. She looked beautiful. She looked powerful. She looked like the woman he had fallen in love with 20 years ago, before the money rot set in. "She's something, isn't she?" the woman on the bench said, noticing his stare. "Yeah," Arthur croaked. "She is. I heard she's donating the settlement money to a fund for financial abuse victims," the woman said. "My sister went through that. Guy controlled every penny." "It's good to see someone fight back." Arthur closed his eyes. "Financial abuse. Is that what he had done?" He thought he was being a provider. He thought control was love. "Hey, mister," the woman said. "You look like you're having a rough day. You want this?" She held out a granola bar. Arthur looked at it. It was a generic brand. Probably cost 50 cents. Yesterday, he had thrown away a $50 steak because it was slightly overcooked. He took the bar. His hands were shaking. "Thank you," he whispered. That night, Arthur slept in a shelter on the Lower East Side. He lay on a cot, listening to the coughing and muttering of the other men. He thought about the Centurion card. He thought about the private jet. He thought about the way Vivian used to look at him before the contempt set in. He realized then that the poverty wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the knowledge that he deserved it. 3 months later, the visiting room at the Federal Correctional Institution in Otisville was stark, painted in a depressing shade of institutional beige. Arthur sat on one side of the plexiglass partition. He wore a jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too big. He had lost weight. The arrogance that used to puff out his chest was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. The door opened and Vivian walked in. She wasn't wearing a power suit today. She wore a simple white dress, her hair loose. She looked younger, lighter. She sat down opposite him. "Hello, Arthur," she said. Arthur couldn't meet her eyes. "Vivian, I didn't think you'd come. I brought the papers," she said, sliding a manila envelope through the slot. "Divorce decree. It's final. I wanted you to have your copy." Arthur put his hand on the envelope. "Did you take it all?" "The government took most of it," Vivian said. "The fines were substantial. But I managed to salvage the trust for your mother. She'll be taken care of. She won't lose the apartment." Arthur looked up, tears welling in his eyes. "You did that. She didn't do anything wrong, Arthur." "And like her son," Arthur nodded. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry, Vive. I know it doesn't mean anything now. But I am. I got lost. I thought the money made me who I was." "It did make you who you were," Vivian said sadly. "That was the problem. You let the balance sheet become your soul. She reached into her purse. She pulled out a small plastic card. She slid it through the slot. Arthur picked it up. It was a secured credit card from First Hudson Trust. It had his name on it. "What is this?" "It's a starter card," Vivian said. $500 limit. You have to put down a cash deposit to use it. It's for when you get out, to help you build your credit back up. From zero, Arthur looked at the card. It was the same type of card he had mocked a waiter for having years ago. "Why?" he asked. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," Vivian said, standing up. "But Arthur, this time don't forget who holds the bill." She turned to leave. "Vivian," Arthur called out. She stopped, her hand on the door handle. "What are you going to do now?" Vivian smiled. It was a genuine smile, full of hope and mystery. "I'm going to Paris," she said. "I'm opening that gallery. And Arthur, I'm signing the contracts with my own name. Vivian Clark." She walked out. Arthur sat there for a long time, holding the cheap plastic card. He looked at the name embossed on it. Arthur Pendelton. It felt heavy. It felt real. For the first time in his life, he wasn't holding a line of credit. He was holding a consequence. And as the guard came to take him back to his cell, Arthur tucked the card into his pocket, right next to his heart. It was the only thing of value he had left. Arthur Pendelton spent 3 years in federal prison. When he was released, he didn't return to Wall Street. He couldn't. He was banned from the securities industry for life. Instead, he moved to a small town in Ohio and got a job as a bookkeeper for a local bakery. He lives in a 1-bedroom apartment. He takes the bus, and every month he pays off his $500 credit card bill in full on time. Vivian Clark became a legend in the financial world, not for hoarding wealth, but for redistributing it. Her gallery in Paris became a hub for artists who had been exploited by the system. She never remarried. She didn't need to. She had found the one partner she could rely on, herself. The story of the Pendeltons is a reminder that in the ledger of life, the most important currency isn't the one in the bank. It's respect. And if you try to bankrupt the person who loves you, you might just find that you're the one who ends up with an empty account. What a ride! I hope you enjoyed this story of karma, justice, and the ultimate comeback. If you loved watching Arthur get what he deserved, smash that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. What would you have done if you were Vivian? Would you have destroyed him, or would you have walked away? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want more stories about sweet revenge and dramatic twists, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.